let me introduce Adrian Pearce, who's here today from University College London, so just across the road. Adrian has returned to London after a sojourn in Mexico. He spent 3 years at the Colegio de Mexico. Before that, he was in King's College. He was there between 2008 and 2013. And before that, he was a postdoctoral student, researcher, and before a doctoral student at the University of Liverpool, where he wrote a PhD on Bourbon era.
Early Bourbon reform.
Early Bourbon reform.
Yeah.
His book has recently been out on that a couple of years ago, and also a lot on trade, British trade in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So today, Reindigenisation, I can't pronounce that.
Reindigenisation, yeah. So this is my third sort of major substantive research project, although I'm also writing a history of the Falklands War in my spare time, which keeps kind of dragging my attention away from this. I'm going to present an overview of this topic. I'm lucky that Paolo's the only person who was at the talk I gave last term, because the first part is kind of the overview of the theory of the topic, and then I'm going to get a little bit into the cultural. I do present this with some trepidation, I have to say. I mean, all work is work in progress. This is particularly work in progress, and it's work in a fairly early stage. All I've really got is some data that I find interesting and some sort of early hypotheses. But I'm at that stage when I'm still thinking, is this a project or isn't it a project? So I guess that's partly why these talks are so useful. So reindigenisation, then I'll give an overview of the topic as a whole. Does it ring any bells? I don't know whether it rings any bells. But the sort of foundational text for the Andes is this one, George Cuba's The Indian Caste of Peru, 1795 to 1940, which was prompted by the Second Republican Census that came out in 1940. And that was followed by Paul Gutenberg's long substantive essay in the Latin American Search Review, Population and Ethnicity in Early Republican Peru, Some Revisions. And so these are the two most important sources currently available for the 19th century demographic history of Peru, taken on the largest scale, and they're also the two foundational texts for reindigenisation, because they both point to the same basic trend, and the same basic trend being that what they seem to show is that the first half of the 19th century, roughly 1800 to 1850, or possibly 1790s to the 1820s, more narrower period, is the only period since the Spanish conquest in the 16th century when the native population of Peru not only grows substantially in absolute terms, but recovers slightly in proportional terms as well. So according to Gutenberg, the native population of Peru is about 61.3% in 1795. It had been growing strongly in absolute terms since about 1730. And then he says it's actually gone up slightly by 1827 to 61.6. And as late as the first Republican census in 1876, it hasn't dropped very much. And he would say even that figure of 58% is affected by epidemics that affect the kind of broad demographic trend, and also by the arrival in Peru of a Chinese and Asian population. So that's to say then that in the decades immediately following independence, Peru actually gets more indigenous than it had been before. So the notion is that it re-indigenises. And the re-indigenisation is at an absolutely minimal extent, less than 0.5% in these figures, assuming these figures are correct. But it's still significant, because this would represent the only period since the 1530s, and the only period since the late 19th century when the national process of mestizaje, the process of national mestizaje, was checked over some decades, and even very slightly reversed. And I mentioned in my talk I gave last term, these figures are more impressive to me, having spent 3 years at the Colegio de Mexico, because I work there with Juan Pedro Biqueda, who's a colleague who's most interested in these broad trends of indigenisation and demographic history in the Mexican case. I mean, he's particularly an expert in Chiapas, but he works on all sorts of things. And he pointed out that the 19th century is the great century of de-indigenisation in Mexico. So in the circa 1800, the proportion of native population in the population of both Peru and Mexico is about the same. It's about 60%. But while in Peru, even in 1900, Indians still make up more than half of the population, largely because, Gutenberg would say, of this process of re-indigenisation, or the halting of national mestizaje. In Mexico, that figure had fallen to 13% by 1900, if it is measured by native language use. And of course it could be measured by other things. But it's still pretty striking. I mean, it gives a dramatically different sense of the experience in both countries in the 19th century, for reasons that are not really clear, although some people have suggested they're to do with the different proletarianization of the native population in Mexico and Peru in the late 18th century. Now, nobody underestimates the problems with these figures or with any attempt to gauge the demographic history of Peru at any period, in fact, until the late 20th century. Demographic history is an absolute minefield. I published my second substantive article on that in 2001 on a Peruvian population census undertaken in the 1730s. And I won't ever go near demographic history again if I can possibly avoid it. But so Gutenberg's the first to recognise in that article the potential questions that one can have around these figures, these fiscal categories rather than ethnic categories. There's all sorts of problems, but the basic sort of starting point is that you've certainly got a native population that's growing very strongly and has been for 100 years, and it seems to have checked at the national level the process of mestizaje. And the explanation for that, very briefly, lies in the crisis of the colonial state and afterwards the republican state, as a result of the wars of independence and the period that follows. So, caused by I've taken out my slide. I was going to have a slide. Circumstances of the early 19th century. So, chronic political instability, age of caudillos, constant wars, notably the Peru-Bolivia Confederation, constant changes of the constitution, all the rest of it. Secondly, an economic crisis caused originally by the destruction of the wars of independence and then by the kind of economic dislocation that follows over the decades that follow, isolation from international markets, collapse of foreign trade, crisis in the hacienda sector, and so on and so forth. And then finally a fiscal crisis. You've got very low government revenues, persistent chronic fiscal deficits. And so the scenario is that crisis of the state in the first half of the 19th century was what permitted and lay behind this kind of reflorescence of the native world, broadly understood, because it goes far beyond demographic, the demographic data alone. However it's understood, that crisis, the notion is, it's reflected in the Sierra. It's reflected in the collapse of the state in the Sierra, or a partial retreat of the state from the Sierra and the areas of majority indigenous settlement, a reduction in the kind of coercive capacity of the state, and the ability of the state to impose itself and to exploit the native population and to support its allies and its political and economic sectors most allied to it. And it's this then that permits this kind of reflorescence of the native world that I am interpreting under the general concept of reindigenization. So reindigenization can be all sorts of things as well as demographic. Gutenberg says, naturally isolated and sheltered by the breakdown in national politics, communications and markets during the Caudillo era, indigenous communities were left mainly to themselves. No army of local officials entered their hamlets, and the local hacendado was reduced to first among equals. Thus, Indians were freed from the traditional, increasingly intrusive oppressions of the colonial regime and enjoyed, if by default, a penurious respite from the market pressures of emerging capitalism. And this goes on well into the late 19th century. It's only from the 1870s onwards that sweeping processes of what's been called the first modern globalization revert the trend and result in a renewal of national mestizaje, modern mestizaje. So there's a return to economic and political stability, the regrowth of foreign trade bonds, the revalorization of land, growing stability and strength of the state, and so on and so on and so forth. From the 1870s, reindigenization stops at the national level, and the process of national mestizaje takes hold. So Gutenberg says that the native population of Peru dropped below 50% for the first time at some point between 1900 and 1920. Even then, though, that's only at the national level, because work done on what's a parallel process of what's called, or an accompanying process of what's called late reindigenization. That's to say, reindigenization that happens after 1870. And I'm thinking mainly of Mark Turner's From Two Republics to One Divided. He talks about late reindigenization. That book, of course, looks at the province that he calls Huaylas Ancash, and he points out that until 1850, the population of Huaylas Ancash is about half indigenous and about half non-indigenous, primarily mestizo. But by 1940, this process of late reindigenization has shifted the percentage to 2/3 indigenous, 1/3 non-indigenous. And this is only one of the provinces affected by so-called late reindigenization. The other ones there is about 10 provinces in a slew going from the centre to the south of the highlands. So that's the general focus then of the project, and the basic idea for this originally came out of something Gutenberg says in that article. I've taken down my slide of Paul Gutenberg in case I was accused again of hero worship. But he was the first historian to take this topic of reindigenisation and think about it beyond, well, he wasn't the first, but he was among the first, to think about it beyond the purely demographic dimension and to begin to explore what he calls its compelling historical and anthropological implications. So he notes that demographic reindigenisation must have reflected wider socio-economic and political conditions around native peoples at this time. And at the same time, this rapid demographic growth among native peoples in the early 19th century must itself have had broader consequences in terms of a greater protagonism of native peoples in national life in Peru during this time. The project's focused mainly on Peru. There's very closely parallel things going on in Bolivia, although to a somewhat lesser extent, and Ecuador doesn't seem to have had a process, any comparable process, as far as I can tell so far anyway. So the book, as it takes shape, is intended to be the first general study of reindigenisation. So it's looking at reindigenisation kind of in a holistic sense. And this is my hypothetical draft contents page. So an introduction that will set the kind of theoretical framework. And then a section on the demography of this, which I'll basically base on Kruger and Gutenberg and revisit, and then I might contribute a little bit of additional primary data. And then the substantive chapters, one on reindigenisation politics, one on reindigenisation in the economy, and then two on culture. The first, well, I'll come back to those in a moment, but that's the kind of outline of the book. And the basic sources so far have been travellers' accounts from the 19th century. So this is both foreign travellers, people like Clements Markham, the distinguished British traveller, subsequently head of the Royal Geographical Society and so on. The Frenchman Paul, and I don't know, Paul, is his surname Marcoy or Marcoy? M-A-R-C-O-Y. Relying on your Franco. I'll say Marcoy, French traveller, and then there's people like Swiss Jakob Johann von Schuli. But there's several dozen of these travellers, mostly Europeans, some North Americans, some Japanese, and then Peruvian travellers too, including some very distinguished people like Antonio Raimondi. So I'm interested in non-native travellers and witnesses to the indigenous world in the Andes of the 19th century. And that choice originally started as a practical one because I was stuck in Kings, I had no chance to get to Peru, and I thought, well, how am I going to get at this topic? I can go to the British Library and look at the primary sources. There are, of course, all sorts of problems with travellers' accounts, and that is an aspect that I have not gone into sufficiently closely. But I do defend their value as source material on native peoples at this time. And one thing that really strikes me is how interested they are in the native world. That they all talk at great length about all aspects of native society in the Andes at this time. And I particularly enjoy it in this context because all of these sources, I haven't discovered a single new traveller's account. So it's all well-worn stuff. Most of it's on the net anyway. I didn't really need to go to the British Library, it turns out. Everybody's looked at these things many, many times. These are well-worn sources. But what's interesting for me so far is to look at them through the theoretical prism of reindigenisation, and it kind of flips the meaning of the sources round in some key cases, I think. I think if you read the sources, thinking about this notion that there's a kind of broader reflorescence in the native world, then you can actually read what are usually quite dispreciative sources in a different way, I hope. Now, some work has been done on some of these aspects already. The aspect that's least been dealt with is actually the subject of today's talk, the cultural one. Politics has been worked by a number of people. Two main models, I would say. One, Tristan Platz, going all the way back to 1982, Estado Boliviano y Algo Andino. So he was a real forerunner in reindigenisation studies, although he didn't use the term. And as you know, he emphasises the fiscal weakness of the state in early Republican Bolivia. He suggests that this fiscal weakness, chronic lack of income, constant fiscal deficit and crisis, leads to a dependence on native tribute as the one surviving stable source of income. And he says that dependence gave native communities bargaining power in their relations with the early Republican state, which they parley into a basic respect for community land holdings. Right? So he famously affirms that the native communities come to understand their relations with the state during this period in terms of a reciprocal pact, un pacto recíproco, in which payment of tribute guarantees respect for and the guarantee of community land holdings. So here we have a model in which it's the fiscal weakness of the early Republican state that becomes a tool in the hands of native communities, and which they use to conserve their land holdings throughout most of the century. So in Bolivia it's only from the 1860s, really only from the 1870s and 1880s you get a renewed kind of liberal assault and a rapid erosion of native land holdings. The second model is that of Cecilia Mendes in the Bolivian Republic, 2005. The IEP edition came out in 2014. And she, of course, places a suggestive title, right? It's the Bolivian Republic, that's exactly what it's about. A period that she dates, the end date is 1850, so slightly earlier than I would place it. She places a different emphasis from Platt. In fact, she regards his model as kind of outmoded. On the chaos of the Caudillo era as opening up a space for genuine peasant participation in national political life that hadn't existed before. So in other words, she argues that again the weakness of the state, and especially the dependence of caudillos on native communities for men and for all kinds of logistical support and supplies, tied to the new discourse of citizenship that comes with liberalism and that caudillos are forced to employ during this period, meant that indigenous peasants could play an active role in national politics that they hadn't been able to do before. And she ties that, of course, particularly to the Huanta Rebellion, the significant native indigenous rebellion in Peru in the immediate post-independence period, 1825 to 1828, which had always been dismissed because it's this kind of odd pro-monarchist rebellion. And she argues that she's got this whole sophisticated argument about how cleverly native peoples were manipulating the political system at the time. Now, I mean, this is an area that I've got relatively little on in my database from my sources that I'm accumulating over time as the project goes on. But what is very striking to me is the lack of deference among native peoples during this time. And if one understands lack of deference in political terms, it's very striking how non-deferential native peoples are to foreign travellers during this time. And how dangerous, actually, it is to travel in the Andes in the early 19th century. I mean, it's a sense of kind of lawlessness runs as a common theme through the narratives from this period. For the economic dimension, two authors. One, Eric Langer, who was a bit of a trailblazer, series of articles that I find very suggestive. His work explores the extent to which the national economies of Peru and Bolivia came to depend on the indigenous sector in the early 19th century, to an almost unprecedented extent. So he argues that given the broader economic crisis in the Andes following independence, and given the collapse of the export sector and the crisis in the hacienda sector, the national economies in Peru and Bolivia came to depend on what he calls the ethnic Andean economies to a greater extent than at any time since the 16th century. A striking claim. This is the case in practically all sectors, according to Langer: mining, agriculture, production of camelid wools. He also looks at the striking case of some particular communities in Oruro in Bolivia who become traders on a vast scale, traders in all kinds of things, including wool and animals and also silver, across a vast region from southern Peru all the way through into northern Argentina and Chile, and become far more prosperous as a result, he claims. The second author is Carlos Contreras, and particularly this piece, Menos plata pero más papas. And in very brief summary, Carlos Contreras sketches here for Peru a model that's been applied already elsewhere in Latin America. This is what for Mexico John Tutino called agrarian decompression, a de-squashing of the rural sector, the notion that a crisis in the capitalist economy and in export-oriented agriculture not only might, but theoretically should, represent not a crisis but an opportunity, a moment of opportunity and relief for the non-capitalist rural peasant subsistence-based agriculture, including the indigenous sector. So that's to say, Peru may well have produced menos plata, but it produced más papas. So what looks like a crisis in the national economy actually can redound to the benefit of the sectors of the population that are engaged in subsistence agriculture. And there is certainly abundant evidence in travellers' accounts, and I was trying to show this in my talk last term, for an extremely vigorous, productive, diverse agricultural economy among peasants and native peoples at this time. So that's that. Now, the cultural aspect is the one that's been least explored at all. I mean, I'm tempted to say that nobody's worked on it, although one never says that because I'm bound to be wrong. But Some historians then have studied this political and economic aspect. Very few have worked on the cultural dimension to it at all. Of course, there were studies of native Andean culture in the 19th century, but few that approach the topic explicitly through this prism of reindigenisation. And I think I've come to understand why. On the one hand, the travel accounts are relatively disappointing in a number of respects. I mean, I went to them expecting to find lavish accounts of some aspects of native culture that I haven't found yet. Major native religious ceremonies, for example, and particularly pilgrimage sites. I thought I'd find stuff about native pilgrimage sites in the Andes, and I haven't yet. But the key problem is probably to fit the cultural dimension within the theoretical framework of reindigenisation. And the key issue is to determine whether the cultural practices that we see in the Andes in the 19th century represent a kind of reflorescence, a new growth of the native presence in the Andes, a kind of a new dynamism in native cultural and life ways during the 19th century, or simply the continuation of practices that go back into the colonial period. That is an issue with the entire topic of reindigenisation, in fact. How can we tell whether what we're looking at in the 19th century is something new, or something more vigorous or dynamic, or something that's simply more visible, partly because there are more foreigners travelling in the Andes in the 19th century than in the colonial period, and more of them are writing and publishing about it. Now the first of my two chapters then focuses on fiestas, festivals and ceremonies. That was an inevitable choice because 19th century travellers' accounts are stuffed with accounts of festivals and ceremonies and rituals that are going on in and around native communities. These can be said to constitute a constant theme, in fact, in travellers' accounts. It seems that a 19th century traveller in the Andes could not set foot in a native village without coming across some kind of festival or ceremony of one kind or another. And these accounts describe certainly an extremely vibrant cultural life in the Andes, which at the very least suggests that native communities had the resources of all kinds to sustain an extremely rich kind of ritual calendar. I will mention just one type of festival or ritual described by these travellers, which was the most surprising to me, although a comment by Mark Turnham in the last term makes me wonder whether I should have been surprised in the way that I was. But these are ceremonies relating to the Incas, or commemorating the conquest in some fashion or another. Because ceremonies relating to the Incas and harking back to the conquest and representing the moment of conquest in different ways seem to have been widespread throughout Peru and Ecuador during this period, not in Bolivia. And these range from the relatively simple to the quite elaborate. For example, both George Squier, a famous North American traveller, and Paul Marcoy mention ceremonies undertaken by Indians when they enter or leave Cusco, and that express their respect for the Inca capital. We've probably come across these. Marcoy describes an elaborate ceremony of leave-taking based on a tree called the Chachacumayok, el árbol de los adioses, near San Sebastián, on the outskirts of Cusco. Have we heard of this? The tree was supposed to have been planted by Tupac Amaru in the mid-13th century. And more specifically, Heinrich Witt, a German who lived in Peru for some decades, describes, I'll just give a few examples of these, and you will tell me whether they're striking or not. He describes something he witnesses in Cajamarca. So he says there's a piedra de granito que se encontraba frente al altar mayor en la capilla de la prisión, en la cual había una hendidura circular que, la tradición decía, fue ocasionada por la vasija que recibió la sangre de Atahualpa después de ser ejecutado. Witt also describes a fascinating example from Payasca in northern Ancash. This is just a fragment, although a long one. He says, el gran asunto del día fue una procesión en celebración por las heridas e injusticias que había sufrido el Inca Atahualpa en manos de los españoles. 4 o 5 indios o mestizos, en viejos sacos militares con puños rojos, representaban a los españoles. Un indio con una corona de lata en la cabeza, llevando en la mano una larga vara con un pequeño espejo en la punta, con pantalones cortos y cubierto con gran cantidad de cintas, era Atahualpa. Otro, vestido de manera similar, su amigo y ministro Chimunga. La corte del Inca estaba compuesto por un gran número de hombres, mujeres y también niñas, caminando de dos en dos. Las mujeres caminaban de forma muy reservada, sin levantar los ojos del suelo. La ausencia de colores alegres y el predominio de los oscuros denotaba duelo por el melancólico destino de su último e infeliz gobernante nativo. Frustratingly, Witt decides to leave before the key day of this ceremony. But the mention there of an amigo ministro of Atahualpa, Chimungo, is particularly enigmatic. I mean, it's tempting to think it's something to do with Chimu, but it's not Quechua, and I've asked a series of Andean linguists what it might be. It's not clear who that refers to. It's not a name that comes up in the chronicles. But there's more. Charles Wiener, a French-Austrian traveller, he describes another ceremony, again in Payasca, as late as the 1870s, and this is held at the bridge of Tabla Chaca, and it's got a very different purpose to this one. So he says, Huáscar, último rey legítimo, fue degollado cerca del puente por orden de su hermano sublevado Atahualpa. Los indios conservan recuerdo del asesinato de su rey, y al pasar por estos parajes hacen 12 veces el signo de la cruz. Después de pasar el puente se purifican las manos mojándolas en las aguas del río. Simple y dramático espectáculo que ofrece esa raza que desde hace cerca de 4 siglos se esfuerza en lavar la mancha de sangre con que se ensuciaron algunos malhechores. And you get these ceremonies across Peru and up into Ecuador. So an example from Ecuador, North American naturalist James Orton, he reports from Quito in 1867. La mascarada, I've done it in English. The masquerade in Machachi was evidently intended to keep alive the memory of the Incas. 3 Indians, fantastically adorned with embroidered garments, plumed headdresses, and gold and silver tinsel, representing Atahualpa and his generals, danced to the music of the rudest kind. One individual pounding on a drum and blowing on a pipe at the same time. Before them went 3 clowns, or diablos, with masks, fit caricatures of the Spaniards. And these are just a sample. There are a series of accounts of this kind of Incanizing ceremonies going on across the region. I'll just give one more example. This again is from Paul Marcoy, who describes a tradition in the Cathedral of Cusco in the 1860s, which, again, if anybody's heard of it before, or whether it has any continuity. Una tradición que los nestores indígenas de piel morena y largas trenzas han difundido entre el pueblo coloca un lago bajo la catedral cuyas aguas tranquilas y como dormidas durante todo el año se hincha, borbotea y golpea sordamente las losas del coro, el día del aniversario de la entrada al Cusco de los conquistadores españoles. Ese día de duelo para los indígenas no es raro, al atravesar la esplanada del atrio, ver a unas almas crédulas arrodillados en el polvo, con una oreja contra el suelo, escuchando con el aire más serio del mundo, si las aguas fatídicas murmuran. Now, this, of course, is not only a cultural question. Some travellers imputed a political sense to this type of ritual. Von Schudy writes in 1840 that Indians across the southern sierras se entregan a la hermosa esperanza de recuperar el dominio y sus derechos perdidos hace tanto tiempo. Los eventos y la memoria de este tiempo se renuevan cuidadosa y constantemente. En la mayoría de las provincias sureñas, los indios se reúnen en días señalados en la choza del más anciano o del cacique y escuchan los cuentos de la historia de los incas, de los hechos de sus descendientes y de la revolución de Tupac Amaru. This is part of a much longer passage in which he's really, in very striking terms, predicting a race war, coming race war. Now, I don't know what you make of those. They certainly seem to emphasize how strong a cultural memory of the Incas and the conquest was as late as the 19th century. These kind of Inca nationalism of the 18th century clearly runs on into the 19th century. What's much harder to do is to fit these practices into the culture, into the framework of reindigenization, or cultural reindigenization. Do these festivals and rituals, of which these are just some, represent a new kind of reflorescence of cultural life among native peoples in the Andes? Or are they simply the continuation of practices in unbroken form from the colonial period? And I was more tempted to think the latter, but Mark Turner said it's pretty clear you get these things going on in the colonial period too. What does seem clear is that this must mark a difference between the post-Tupac Amaru rebellion period, when I can't believe that these ceremonies would have gone on in quite the open, non-apologetic, non-deferential way that they're described by travellers in the aftermath of the Tupac Amaru rebellion. But I guess it's a question that remains to be seen. The second bit is the bit I've done most work on, actually, reindigenization in native languages. This is the only bit I've published anything on so far. I've got a piece on reindigenization in the economy coming out in the Historia Mexicana in Spanish in the next number. But this was in a book edited with linguist Paul Hegarty, History and Language in the Andes, a few years ago, and I published a piece on reindigenisation, native languages. And something similar occurs for native languages as it does for rituals and festivals. In other words, travellers' accounts are a rich source, not as rich as for festivals and ceremonies. Some travellers don't talk about language. Some, on the other hand, talk about language very extensively. So you get travellers who are travelling from A to B across a vast swathe of the Andes, and as they go, they comment in each village on what the people speak and the degree to which they speak Spanish or don't. And the Sierra in these accounts is unambiguously a native language space. It's a space in which Spanish occupies not only a minority role, but a really quite precarious role. It's not just that native language is widespread, which we can take for granted. What's particularly striking is how widely these indigenous languages were spoken by non-indigenous sectors, both mestizos and whites and Creole population, and how high their social prestige was, even among whites or Creoles. And this again is something that, talking to Mexican scholars, is very striking to them. The notion that you get a large proportion of mestizos, but also whites, routinely speaking native languages well into the late 19th century, doesn't seem to have a parallel in Mexico, any very clear parallel. The doubt again is, are we witnessing something? What are we actually witnessing here? Are we witnessing an expansion? Do we actually see an expansion of languages that become more vigorous, more dynamic, more widely spoken, both geographically and socially, than in the late colonial period? Or does this just represent an unbroken tradition going on? And that's actually quite difficult to prove. But the vibrancy of Quechua during the mid-19th century is still unquestionably significant, because it demonstrates that the language enters the Republican period, and actually probably the 20th century almost, in vibrant health. And some extremely eminent Quechuists, who know much more about Quechua and its history than I ever will, have sustained that the modern decline of Quechua dates from the early Republican period, late colonial, early Republican period. I'm thinking particularly of Seta Aiki, who straddles history and linguistics in a way that few people do. In this piece, it was published a long time ago. I don't know. He may well have changed his opinion since, but he sustains that. Well, it's not only him in actual fact. It's also Bruce Mannheim. Again, that book, 25 years old now. Maybe he'd say something different now. Language of the Inca since the European invasion, which is kind of taken as a standard text in English on the history of Quechua. Though I think linguists take it more seriously than historians do, I would say. But the argument is that, so Mannheim barely mentions Quechua in the 19th century. He's got the history in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, and then he skips to the 19th century, so that's not important. The argument is, in these pieces, is that the decline of Quechua comes about due to policies of the state in the aftermath of the Tupac Amaru rebellion in the 1780s. So it's primarily the result of the loss of social prestige around Quechua, with the decline of the native nobility, not only decrees banning Quechua, but also the kind of decline of the Curacascos around the time of independence. And what's striking is that travellers' accounts make clear that that version is simply not right. The language Quechua I'm talking about not only continued to be spoken by the vast majority of the population, both native and non-native, but its social prestige among whites is probably higher in the 19th century than it's been before. And so some of the most striking evidence of all then is for the use of Quechua by whites during this period, including the highest levels of Creole society in the provinces. So Sir Clements Markham, British explorer and scholar, he goes to Peru in the early 1850s expressly with the intention of learning Quechua, and he lives for some months in Ayacucho with the purpose of doing so, and he learns Quechua there not in some isolated rural community as one might do today, but from the sisters of the prefect of Ayacucho, Manuel Tello. And in a celebrated passage in one of his books, he comments on the social prestige of Quechua among whites in the Sierras. This is in the 1850s. And he says, at the present day, the Quichua is spoken as generally and with almost as much purity as in the time of the Incas, not only by the poor Indians, but by the descendants of Spaniards of every rank of society in the Sierra. As their nurses are always Indian girls, Quichua is the first language they speak, while Spanish is learnt afterwards and studied at school. At certain intervals, the sermons preached in Quechua in the churches of larger towns, and in the villages the priests used no other language. The Indian bards, too, attend at the dinner and evening parties in the farms of their masters and chant Quechuan melodies as accompaniments to the dance. And all classes seem attached to the old language of the Incas. It is agreeable to find that the beautiful language of the Incas has been zealously cultivated by the descendants of their conquerors. Evidence is particularly strong for the use of Quechua by Creole women as opposed to men. And some Creole women do not seem to have spoken Spanish particularly fluently, certainly not as a first language. Von Schudy noted that the poor Spanish of Creoles in the Sierra made them the target of mockery when they came down to the coast. So he says, la vida social en la Sierra es tan peculiar que resulta comprensible que los habitantes de Lima se burlen de los serranos y los traten con cierto desprecio. Ya el lenguaje de los serranos los caracteriza, es duro, incorrecto y mezclado con muchas palabras quechuas. Por ello se sienten a gusto solo por poco tiempo en la capital, donde se convierten en blanco de las burlas femeninas y pronto extrañan sus cerros natales, donde pueden vivir de manera más desenvuelta con la mayor tranquilidad del mundo. And Paul Marcoy also comments on the imperfect Spanish of Creole women in Cusco. So he says, su vida monótona y desprevista de incidentes, su lejanía de los centros civilizados, la cierta dificultad que experimentan al hablar el español, al que, según dicen las mujeres de Lima y de Arequipa, ellas estropean. Todas estas causas dan a sus maneras no sé qué timidez ingenua y qué púdica torpeza de un sabor encantador, y que en vano se buscará en las mujeres del litoral. Now, the holy grail for this topic, which I have not yet found, would be evidence of Creole men who have imperfect Spanish, or have lost the Spanish altogether. And there are intriguing hints in a paper given a long time ago by Henri Favre in Mexico City, Relaciones sociales y procesos culturales y los fenómenos de indianización en Huancavelica. Favre seems to claim to have encountered a petty Creole population in the province of Huancavelica that's actually re-indigenized almost entirely, including in linguistic terms. Unfortunately, he never published the paper, so this is just an abstract, it's a 2-page abstract. And I asked Luis Miguel Glavi, who's one of the editors, what Favre had said. I think Favre's still alive, actually.
Yeah, I met him a couple of years ago.
At one point I was thinking trying to track him down. But Glavi said that is indeed what Favre claimed in that paper, that he's found this sort of deep provincial community of Creoles who've kind of lost their Spanish. So this is a key question then, the spread of Quechua. It may well have spread geographically, so it may well have actually conquered new territories among native peoples that it had not done before. I mean, the shift of Quechua and Aymara has been an ongoing process over the past 500 years. We know that the presence of Aymara on the Altiplano is actually a very recent thing, possibly even as recent as the colonial period, or substantially colonial. But the evidence certainly suggests that it spread socially at this time, far beyond indigenous peoples themselves. And if you look at the case of Ancash, so that case of Ancash that Turner discusses from two publics to one divided. So remember, he says in 1850 it's about half indigenous, non-indigenous in Ancash, and then by 1940 it's about 2/3 indigenous and 1/3 non-indigenous. But 95% of the population speaks Quechua in 1940. So that suggests almost the entire non-indigenous population speaks Quechua, and that presumably means that it's the main vehicle for social communication in Huaylas Ancash. There's one final unquestionable relevance of reindigenization of native language in Peru. As we know, the north of Peru, and I apologise for the poor quality of the slide, but the north of Peru, both on the coast and in the highlands, was once the region of greatest linguistic diversity in Peru, where many native languages were spoken. But this linguistic diversity was lost almost entirely between about 1870 and about 1930. So in the late 18th century, many indigenous languages spoken only in the bishopric of Trujillo, including Quingnan, that's the large one stretching down the coast, Mochica, the languages of Piura on the coast, Culli in the highlands around Huamachuco. But all of these indigenous languages disappeared in the same broad half-century or century, late 19th, early 20th century. Some of them survived long enough, but there's significant, like Mochica's, there's significant linguistic data on Mochica. And all they leave is isolated pockets of Quechua in the highlands. So there's a few isolated pockets of Quechua in the highlands to this day, places like Lambayeque, Chiclayo, Ferreñafe. And when I've asked linguists why those languages disappeared, they never had a very good answer. They talk in general terms in small languages, restricted geographical distributions, low numbers of speakers, and so on and so forth. But they never really give any very clear explanation as to why they die out. And when I came to look at Kubler and Gutenberg's demographic data, something immediately sort of jumped out of it, which is that the north of Peru, both the highlands and the coast, is the only region of Peru that does not experience the process of reindigenization, and where the process of mestizaje continues unbroken from the colonial period right the way through to the 20th century. So the north of Peru shifts to strong mestizo majorities by the 1870s and late 19th century. It's practically the only region in the country where Indians become ever smaller minorities within a population which is strongly mestizo and Spanish-speaking. And the reasons for that can be debated too, but it seems clear that reindigenization holds an important key to the disappearance of native languages in the north, because its absence in that region is what permits the kind of swamping and the loss of these languages. The reason small pockets of Quechua survive is particularly enigmatic, because it seems that they were never larger than those small pockets. You know, it's not like they're the remaining redoubts of a carpet speaking of Quechua across the northern highlands. It seems they were only ever small islets, possibly even going back to the Wadi Empire. So that's then the nature of the topic. It is a work in progress. The two major areas then are festivals and ceremonies and native language use. I'm still collecting data, and the key question, I think, is how does one relate this to the potential topic of reindigenization? You've certainly got a demographic kind of reflorescence. There's strong evidence on the economic side of a respite during this period for native communities, that they seem to be doing rather well or less appallingly than they have done before. There's some evidence in the political sphere too. The task is to tie this to that topic of reindigenization and to detect really whether what we're seeing is indeed a kind of a reflorescence in cultural terms or something else. I'll finish there.